The summer sun was merciless that day, baking the dusty town square of Dry Creek until the wooden boards of the auction platform groaned and popped with heat. Horses stamped nervously at the posts, sweat darkening their hides. Flies buzzed, and the scent of leather, sweat, and dust hung in the air like a thick blanket. Men crowded around the auction stage, rough ranchers in sweat-stained hats, prospectors with weathered faces, and even a few traveling merchants, all eager to watch the curious sale. Cattle and horses were usually the draw, but today was different. Today, they were auctioning off a man. Clara Hayes stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching the string of her worn bonnet beneath her chin. She wasn't supposed to be there. A respectable woman, at least, that's what people whispered she ought to be, shouldn't be near such a spectacle. But Clara had never been one to let aught stop her before. Not when her very survival depended on it. Her husband had died 2 winters ago, leaving her with nothing but a failing farmstead on the edge of town. Since then, she'd lived on little more than stubbornness and scraps. Every door she knocked on for work had closed. No one wanted to hire a widow with more spine than sense. But Clara was desperate. And desperate women looked for desperate chances. She hadn't come to buy a man. Heavens, no. She had only come to see if the rumors were true. They said the sheriff had captured a giant out in the hills, a man so strong it took 6 armed deputies to drag him in. They said he had a sack tied over his head because his face terrified folks. They said he hadn't spoken a word since being brought into town, chained hand and foot like some wild beast. And now the town leaders, tired of feeding him in the jailhouse, had decided to auction him off like livestock. Clara's hands trembled as she pushed her way closer through the crowd. She didn't know what she expected to see. Maybe a monster. Maybe nothing at all. But when she caught sight of him, her breath snagged in her throat. The man on the stage was enormous. He towered over the auctioneer, shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. Shackles gleamed on his wrists and ankles, chains running between them. His head was covered with a rough burlap sack, the fabric darkened around the mouth where breath had dampened it. His chest rose and fell steadily, controlled, as if the entire scene, the jeering crowd, the ropes, the humiliation, meant nothing to him. But what struck Clara most was his silence. He didn't struggle. He didn't roar like some wild beast. He simply stood, unyielding, like a mountain that had been forced into chains. The auctioneer cleared his throat, sweat dripping down his temples. "All right, folks. This here's, well, I can't rightly tell you his name, but you can see what you're gettin'. Strong as an ox, eats like one too. Sheriff says he's dangerous, but you put a man like this behind a plow, and you'll get 10 men's worth of work out of him." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "Or put him in the mines. He'll dig you a mountain o' gold. Or sell him to the railroad," another voice called. Clara felt a pang in her chest. The way they spoke, as if he weren't even human. As if his silence meant he had no soul. The bidding began at $10. Hands shot up. 15, 20, 25. The crowd jostled with excitement, though most of it was cruel amusement rather than real intention to buy. Clara watched the price climb, her heart pounding for reasons she didn't understand. At $40, the hands slowed. At 50, they stopped. The auctioneer barked, $50 for a giant of a man. Come now, folks, don't let a prize like this slip away. But no one spoke. No one lifted a hand. The crowd had had its fun, but no rancher wanted to risk $50 on a man they couldn't even see clearly, when the sheriff himself had called dangerous. The auctioneer's voice cracked with frustration. "All right, then. Who'll give me 20? 10? 5? The silence grew heavy. Dust swirled in the still air. Finally, someone in the back shouted, half in jest, "I'll give you $1 just to haul him out of here." The crowd erupted in laughter. Clara's chest tightened. She looked at the man again, this giant, this silent figure who stood as steady as the earth itself, and before she even knew what she was doing, she raised her hand. "I'll pay $1, she said, her voice clear, ringing out over the mocking laughter. The auctioneer blinked, stunned. The crowd turned to stare at her. Clara Hayes, the stubborn widow with a failing farm and no business meddling in men's affairs. But her hand did not waver. The auctioneer's lips curled into a smirk. "Sold. To the lady in the bonnet for $1. The gavel cracked down. The crowd howled with delight, some clapping, some jeering, as if it were the grandest joke they'd ever seen. Clara's cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin. She walked forward, her boots raising little puffs of dust with each step, until she stood at the edge of the stage. The sheriff himself appeared, scowling as if he'd swallowed vinegar. "You can't be serious, Mrs. Hayes. You can't take him." "You auctioned him, Sheriff," Clara said evenly. "And I bought him fair. $1. The sheriff cursed under his breath. He looked at the man, this giant in chains, and then back at Clara. "If he kills you, don't come crying to me." Clara's voice softened, though her heart thundered. "If he wanted to kill anyone, Sheriff, he'd have done it already." The sheriff glared but waved his deputies over. With muttered grunts, they hauled the chained man down from the stage and shoved him toward Clara. The sack shifted, but he made no sound, no protest. Only the rattle of chains marked his presence. The crowd dispersed, muttering about the foolish widow who had wasted her last dollar on a beast of a man. Clara stood firm. She didn't know what she had just done. She only knew that when she looked at him, this silent man who had been mocked, chained, and sold for a laugh, something deep in her bones had whispered, "He's like me. Broken, unwanted, but not beaten." She tugged the chain gently. "Come," she said. And to her astonishment, the giant obeyed. They walked together through the streets of Dry Creek, the townsfolk gawking openly. A woman and her chained giant, it was the stuff of gossip that would spread faster than fire. Clara kept her eyes forward, ignoring the whispers. At last, they reached the edge of town, where her wagon waited. It was a poor excuse for transport, one wheel wobbling, the paint flaking, but it was hers. She turned to him, biting her lip. "I don't know if you understand me," she said softly, "but I won't keep you in chains, not if you mean me no harm." Her fingers trembled as she fumbled with the iron cuffs. The sheriff's men had given her the key with mocking laughter, certain she'd never dare use it. But she did. One by one, the locks clicked open. The chains fell to the dirt with a heavy clang. For a long moment, he didn't move. He simply stood there, free, his head still covered by the sack. Then, slowly, he lifted his hands and removed it. Clara gasped. He wasn't hideous. He wasn't monstrous. His face was scarred, yes, a jagged line cutting across his cheek, but his eyes, clear, piercing blue, were steady and calm. Not the eyes of a beast. The eyes of a man who had endured too much. He looked at her, silent still, and something in his gaze made Clara's knees weaken. Gratitude. Resolve. A quiet strength that no chain could break. Clara swallowed hard. "My name is Clara Hayes," she said, her voice unsteady. You'll come with me if you choose. I don't expect you to serve me. Only that we might help each other." For the first time, his lips parted. His voice was low, rough from disuse, but steady. "My name is Elias." The sound of it sent a shiver down Clara's spine. She nodded slowly. "Then, Elias, let's go home." And together, the widow and the giant left the town behind, unaware that their fates had just entwined in ways neither could yet imagine. The road home was long and lonely, the sun slipping low over the horizon as Clara's wagon creaked along the rutted trail. Elias walked beside her in silence, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the dust. Clara stole glances at him as she drove the mule forward. Even without chains, he moved with quiet discipline, each step deliberate, his expression unreadable. She half expected him to vanish into the wild once freed, but he hadn't. He had chosen to stay beside her. When the farmstead finally came into view, a sagging roof, broken fence lines, and a patch of earth that hadn't seen a plow in months, Clara's heart twisted with shame. This was no home for anyone, least of all a man who had been treated like livestock. She slowed the wagon. "It isn't much," she admitted softly, "but it's all I have." Elias turned his gaze to the house, then back to her. He gave a single nod, as if to say it was enough. That first night, Clara cooked the last of her beans and cornbread, setting the plate before him. He sat across from her at the rough-hewn table, his broad shoulders nearly filling the space. "You'll have the barn to yourself," she said quickly, afraid he might think she expected him to share her small cabin. "It's dry enough, and I'll bring blankets." Elias didn't argue. He ate quietly, methodically, though Clara noticed he left half the food untouched, as if careful not to take more than he should. When the meal ended, she rose and carried a lantern out to the barn. He followed her, ducking beneath the low door-frame. She spread a blanket of old quilts in the corner, her hands trembling. "There," she murmured, setting the lantern down. "It isn't much comfort, but—" "Enough," he said, his voice rumbling low. Clara's eyes snapped to his. It was only the second word he'd spoken to her since giving his name, but the sound of it wrapped around her like a promise. She nodded quickly and backed away, leaving him to his rest. But as she lay in her bed that night, listening to the lonely wind scrape against the shutters, She wondered what kind of man she had brought into her life. The days that followed revealed more than Clara expected. Elias rose before dawn, working without command. He mended the broken fence with strength that made short work of the heavy rails. He repaired the sagging roof, his massive frame balancing on the beams with ease. He even tilled the hard, dry soil with his bare hands when Clara's plow gave out, breaking the ground like it was nothing. Clara watched him with awe. Her farmstead, which had been on the verge of collapse, slowly began to breathe again. But it wasn't just his strength that startled her. It was his gentleness. One morning, Clara found him kneeling in the garden, cradling a wounded bird in his palm. His scarred fingers moved carefully, tenderly, as he set the creature back in its nest. Another time, she saw him stop working to untangle her mule's harness, murmuring softly to the beast as if it were a child. And though he spoke little, his silence was never heavy. It was steady, calming, like a river that carried its strength deep beneath the surface. Clara, who had lived with loneliness for so long, began to find peace in his quiet presence. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset burn across the plains, Clara dared to ask the question that had haunted her. "Elias," she said carefully, "why were you chained? Why did they treat you like a beast?" For a long time, he didn't answer. His jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Clara thought he might never speak again. But at last, his voice came, low and rough. "I was a soldier," he said. "Fought in wars that took more than they gave. When it ended, there was nothing left but scars and silence. I wandered. People saw my size, my strength, and feared me. Sheriff found me sleeping by the river. Didn't matter that I'd done no harm. Fear makes chains quickly." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to reach out, to lay her hand over his, but she held back. Instead, she whispered, "You didn't deserve it." His gaze shifted to her then, his blue eyes catching the last light of dusk. For the first time, she saw the faintest curve of a smile. "Nor did you deserve what life gave you," he said quietly. Her breath caught. He had seen through her loneliness, her loss, as easily as if it were written across her skin. She looked away, blinking against sudden tears. Weeks passed, and word spread in Dry Creek that the widow Hayes had tamed her giant. Folks came by under the guise of neighborly visits, but Clara could feel their eyes linger, measuring, judging. Some muttered that she was foolish, others hinted at worse. One afternoon, 3 men rode up, ranch hands from a neighboring spread. They leaned on their saddles, grinning too wide. "Evenin', Clara," one drawled. "Heard you bought yourself a man. Thought we'd see if you might like to sell him proper. Big fella like that could fetch more than $1 in the mines." Clara stiffened. "He isn't for sale." The men chuckled, their eyes crawling over her in ways that made her skin crawl. "Everything's for sale, darlin'. You just don't know the right price yet." Before Clara could answer, Elias stepped out from the barn. He didn't speak, didn't threaten, but his sheer size sent a ripple of unease through the men. His shadow fell over them like a storm cloud. The leader forced a laugh. "Easy there, big man. Just sharing neighborly talk." But when Elias took a single step forward, silent as death, the men spurred their horses and rode off in a cloud of dust. Clara's heart pounded. She turned to him, relief and gratitude swelling inside her. "They would've." "I know," Elias said simply. She looked up at him, at the steady strength in his eyes, and for the first time in years, she felt truly safe. Summer bled into autumn. Together, they worked the farm until it no longer looked like ruin but a place of life. Clara found herself laughing again, small, startled sounds that felt strange on her lips. Sometimes she caught Elias watching her, his scarred face softened, though he always looked away quickly when she noticed. One night, as the first frost settled on the earth, Clara carried a blanket to the barn. She found Elias sitting by the lantern light, sharpening a tool. She hesitated at the door, then stepped closer. "You've given me back more than I ever thought I'd have," she said softly. "I don't know how to repay you." Elias set the tool aside, his gaze lifting to hers. "You gave me freedom," he said. "That is enough." Her heart twisted. She wanted to tell him he had given her freedom too, freedom from fear, from loneliness, from the weight of being unwanted. Instead, She reached for his hand. His fingers were rough, scarred, but when they closed gently around hers, warmth flooded her chest. In that quiet barn, with the lantern flickering and the world hushed outside, Clara realized the truth she had been too afraid to name. She hadn't just bought a man that day at auction. She had found her protector. Her partner. Her heart. Elias's thumb brushed lightly across her knuckles, his blue eyes never leaving hers. And though no words were spoken, the promise was clear. Whatever storms lay ahead, they would face them together.